Time Warrior, the first serial of season 11 of Doctor Who, first broadcast in 4 parts from the 15th of December 1973 to the 5th of January 1974. The first story to feature both Elizabeth Sladen as Sarah Jane Smith and to feature the Sontarans. It's also supposedly the first story in which the Doctor's home planet is actually named as Gallifrey, which, I don't know, I think I viewed in the same light that I viewed The Runaway Bride being the first occasion in New Who where Gallifrey was actually named. I'm just thinking, really, it took that long for them to name it? Fair enough. If that's just the case, I'll roll with it. So, the third Doctor, played once again by Jon Pertwee, he and the Brigadier have seemingly been called to a summit of scientists, and quite a few of the scientists have ended up going missing, just seemingly disappeared out thin air. So all the scientists have kind of gotten together at a big summit at a hotel to try and figure out what's going on and put a stop to it. And among those is also a journalist named Sarah Jane Smith, played by Elizabeth Sladen. She's not actually supposed to be there, but has managed to gain access to the summit using the ID of her great-aunt, Aunt Lavinia Smith, who supposedly is a famous virologist. Sarah Jane is mainly just there looking for a story, but ends up caught up in things when the Doctor, tracking down the missing scientist, ends up travelling to the Middle Ages in the TARDIS, and Sarah Jane ends up tagging along. Within the Middle Ages, you've got a dictator named Iangron, played by David Dacre, or maybe Dacre, I'm not sure. He wants to essentially conquer everything, and he wants specifically to conquer the castle of a man named Edward of Wessex, played by Alan Rowe. He's at war with Edward, and he wants to kind of fight to take over his castle and all the rest of it. However, Iangron and his men have managed to find a crashed spaceship in the middle of the woods, and inside that crashed spaceship is a Sontaran named Lynx, played by Kevin Lindsay, who would actually return for the last story of Jon Pertwee's era, playing Choji in Planet of the Spiders. Nice little tidbit for you. Now, really all Lynx wants to do is he wants to use Iangron's castle kind of as a base of operations so he can repair a ship and eventually return back to the war that his race is fighting. But he agrees that in return for allowing him to stick around to fix his ship, he will also provide Iangron with weapons to use against Edward. Now, while the Doctor is seemingly trying to track down the scientists, including a scientist named Professor Rubish, played by Donald Pelmer, Sarah Jane ends up tagging along after briefly looking for the scientist inside the TARDIS. Now, I will admit, with Sarah Jane, she is often seen as one of the gold standards of companions, especially of female companions, because Doctor Who had a bit of a habit, especially in the 60s and possibly the early part of the 70s, that the companion's job was just really to get kidnapped or be held at ransom to scream, and the Doctor would eventually come to save them. Now, Sarah Jane, while she wasn't the first to do so, Sarah Jane kind of helped to change that. When she turns up in the Middle Ages, her first thing is like, oh, this is obviously going to be some kind of Renaissance fair stuff or a visitor centre. Even when she tries to ask people, now come on, stop being silly and talk normally and tell them what the problem is. They're like, begone knave or begone wench. And she obviously gets frustrated, but then she seems to adapt to the situation fairly quickly. Like, okay, this is actually the Middle Ages. Okay, I've got to deal with this in the best way she can. She doesn't just scream for help. When she is, as part of one of the Doctor's plans, down in the kitchens, and one of the, essentially the leader of the servants is particularly abusive, she's like, well, why do you want to be servants? Like, yeah, well, not much we can do while men rule the world. It's like, why don't you stand up for yourself? It's like, it's not our place to do so. You can definitely see that she is different to other companions. Like, she doesn't see why things need to be a certain way, and that's ideally what makes her one of the great ones. As I said, Iangron is currently trying to invade the castle of Edward of Wessex, and he's assisted by his, Edward is assisted by, I think, his wife, or it might just be one of his ladies-in-waitings, a woman named Lady Elmer, played by June Brown, and an archer named Hal, played by Jeremy Bulloch. Now, Bulloch would apparently later go on to portray Boba Fett in the Star Wars movies. So, yeah, nice little bit of tidbit for you. And another famous face who's been able to slip into Doctor Who. Now, as I said, this was supposedly the first mention of Gallifrey, and as I said, I feel that it's a bit weird that they didn't mention actually the name of Gallifrey until quite late on, but if that's just the way it was, fair enough. Now, supposedly when Robert Holmes wrote this story, it was thought that purely historical stories, like they had with the Highlanders back in the 1960s, they didn't know if they would be particularly popular. So, essentially, the head writer at the time, Terence Dicks, asked Robert Holmes to come up with a historical based story, but that also had aliens mixed into it, which is why Robert Holmes ultimately came up with The Time Warrior. And you know what? I actually think it worked, and it was successful, seeing as, well, we still have stories like that today. One of my favourites being The Unicorn and the Wasp from 2008. He also, supposedly, when he was putting forward this story, put forward it as a Sontaran battle report from Field Marshal Holmes to Terran Sedex. Honestly, I think that's funny, but at the same time, yeah, that works for me. And Holmes would later put a similar challenge forward to Dix, who would later come up with Horror Fang Rock in the 1970s. So both of them managed to create two distinct warrior races that would go to war with each other. And I do like that the stuff about the Sontarans isn't added later on. For example, in part 4, they do actually introduce the context of the probic vent at the back of the Sontaran's neck. And the Sontaran even proudly states, it means we always have to face our enemy in battle. Yeah, I think it's great that they established that fairly early on. Plus, this is also the story of one of my favourite lines. There was, when Peter Capaldi became the Doctor, they released a trailer kind of showing kind of famous quotes from different ones of the Doctor, and the one they used for John Pertwee's Doctor actually came from this story. There's a set of dialogue between him and Sarah Jane Smith. It's like, you're serious, aren't you? About what I do, yes. Not necessarily the way I do it. I love that line, and this is where it came about. Now, is this a perfect story? I'd say not, actually. I mean, don't get me wrong, it is immensely enjoyable, but it does have one or two areas where it does sadly fall flat. Once again, the stuff about the parts filmed on tapes and the ones filmed on film, which I had mentioned before, it can get a little grainy while outside. Also, when the Sontaran pod is destroyed towards the end of part 4, an explosion goes off which supposedly destroys the castle. But you can immediately tell that they cut away at the last second from the shot of the castle to do the explosion. They didn't even try to blow up a model of the castle. You can clearly tell that it's two different shots and the explosion is taking place somewhere completely different. But do I think you should watch The Time Warrior? I'd say sure. I mean, it's immensely fun. It introduced one of Doctor Who's longest serving villains to the show with the Sontarans, and you know what, I think it's a good one. Now, it does also leave me in a bit of a quandary. I mean, I do wonder to myself, I now have 3 stories of season 11, those being The Time Warrior, The Monster of Peladon, and Planet of the Spiders. I've only got 2 left to get from that series. Should I get them? I don't know yet, we'll see. But The Time Warrior, check it out. You might find it to be fun. Anyway, the next one I've got on my list is one from my last story from season 12, The Sontaran Experiment. Once I watch that, I'll let you know. Till then, see you.